Previously, a village, a missing woman, a cup of tea still steaming in a store that had been open all night in the March cold. 3 people who each knew one thing about that Friday night. Tung, who heard her crying at the head of the lane and kept walking. Mrs. Hang, who heard the crying through the wall at 11:30 and pulled her curtain closed. Mr. Phuc, who knew exactly where her sister lived and told the police he didn't. None of them killed her. But in an empty store, on the 5th night after she disappeared, someone was still peeling fruit. This is part 2. Mrs. Hang hadn't slept properly since Mrs. Ngan disappeared. Not completely sleepless. She still closed her eyes, still woke at the right time, but the sleep had become thin in the way people describe as sleeping without really sleeping, awake without really being awake, lying somewhere on the border between the two without fully belonging to either side. Her husband didn't notice. He slept the way he always had, snoring steadily, getting up in the morning, eating breakfast, going to the fields, coming home for dinner, watching television and then sleeping. His life continuing exactly as before, as though Mrs. Ngan had never disappeared, or had disappeared and it was a matter that didn't touch him. Mrs. Hang didn't tell him about the wardrobe, about the smell of the well, about the dark blue jacket in the cardboard box behind the storage shed. On the 7th night, she lay listening to the sounds of Dong Phu after dark. Frogs from the pond in the distance, wind across old roof tiles. Somewhere at the far end of the village, a dog barked once and stopped. The familiar sounds of every night, so familiar that normally she didn't hear them at all. Only in the thinness of this sleep did they become distinct, one by one, as though the night were speaking in a language of its own. At 3 in the morning, she heard crying. Not from outside, from Mrs. Ngan's store, the way it had been that night. From the wardrobe. She lay still, listening. The sound was very small, uncertain. It could have been the wood of the wardrobe contracting in the cold night, or it could have been something else. She lay there trying to determine which, trying to sort the sound of a thing from the sound of a person. She couldn't. The line between those two things at 3 in the morning is thinner than people think. She sat up, her husband still snoring. She looked at the wardrobe standing in the corner of the room, the door closed, its shadow falling across the floor in the streetlight coming through the curtain gap. The sound continued, small, voiceless. The kind of crying that belongs to someone who has spent so long crying alone, they no longer need sound to do it. She got up, walked to the wardrobe, set her hand on the wardrobe door, wood cold under her palm. The smell of well water seeping through the door gap, damp and cold and deep, the smell of a place where there is no light. She stood with her hand on the wardrobe door, didn't open it, didn't step back, just stood in the dark of the bedroom with her hand on the wardrobe, listening to the small crying from inside and doing nothing. The sound stopped just before 4 in the morning. Stopped suddenly, the way a candle goes out. Not fading, just gone in one breath. She stood a moment longer, then went back to bed, lay down, looked up at the ceiling in the remaining dark of the night, and this time, she didn't push the thought away, didn't cover it over with anything. She let it sit there in her mind, plain and unadorned. 2 million dong. 5 years. Mrs. Ngan had never asked for it once. And one night, 11:30, crying coming through the wall, a flickering light and then darkness, and she had lain still because she was afraid Mrs. Ngan might mention the money. She lay with that thought until morning. Didn't sleep again. but didn't cry either. Just lay there and let the thoughts stay where it was, unfixed, unresolved, something no amount of anything could touch. Mr. Phuc held the village meeting on the 10th day, updated the residents on the search for Mrs. Ngan, asked that anyone with information contact the police or himself. His voice was steady and responsible, the voice of someone who had led meetings for so long that the voice itself had become a thing he put on when needed, like formal clothes. People nodded, asked a few questions, then dispersed. Back home, he changed his clothes, sat down to dinner with his wife. She asked if there was any new information. He said, not yet. She said, poor woman, living alone like that, it's hard. He didn't respond, just reached for more vegetables. He ate half a bowl and put his chopsticks down. His wife asked why he wasn't eating. He said he wasn't hungry. Stood and went out to the yard, stood alone in the dark, looking up at the thin scattering of stars in the March sky. 15 years as village head. He had handled many things for this village. Land disputes, neighbor conflicts, funerals, weddings, children's schooling. He hadn't resolved every situation correctly, but he had stepped in, taken responsibility. That was something he was proud of. Now he was standing in his yard in the dark, thinking about the rezoning document in the file cabinet. Not the first time. He'd thought about it every day for 10 days, pushing it down each time only to have it surface again. He knew what the right thing was to do. Tell the police about Mrs. Ngan's sister in Phuc. Bring out the rezoning document. Explain why he hadn't told her yet, except being questioned about it. Clear, uncomplicated. But between knowing the right thing and actually doing it, there is a distance that people tend to underestimate until they're standing in front of it. He stood in his yard in the dark and felt the width of that distance. That night, he lay awake until nearly 2 a.m. before sleep came. When he slept, he dreamed. The store, an ordinary day, afternoon sun warm on the counter, the sound of the knife even and steady, the smell of ripe ol in the air. Mrs. Ngan sitting behind the counter, peeling, looking out toward the door. He walked in and sat down in the customer's chair, the way he had on all those afternoons he'd stopped in for tobacco. In the dream, he reached inside his jacket and brought out the rezoning document, set it on the counter surface between them. She didn't look down at it, still peeling, still looking out toward the door. He sat and waited. The document lay between them on the worn wooden counter. She didn't look down. He waited in the warm afternoon light of the store, afternoon that didn't fade, and nobody said anything at all. He woke at 4 a.m. Dark bedroom, cold. His wife sleeping peacefully beside him, breathing the breath of someone who had gone to sleep without anything heavy in their mind. He lay looking at the ceiling, thinking about the dream, about the way Mrs. Ngan hadn't looked down at the document, not because she couldn't see it, but because she already knew what it said. She had always known. He lay with that thought until morning.
Day 15. Officer Duke asked the 3 of them to come to Mrs. Ngan's store that afternoon to confirm a few details in their statements. Standard procedure in missing persons cases, nothing unusual. All 3 arrived on time, sat down inside the store, each in a different place. Tung in the chair in front of the counter, where he used to sit as a child. Mrs. Hung on the low wooden chair near the door, Mr. Phuc leaning against the side wall, not willing to sit. Nobody looked at anyone else. Officer Duke had just finished his 3rd question when Tung's phone vibrated. Tung looked down. The small black and white screen of his Nokia phone flashed. The name on the screen read, Mrs. Ngan.
Nobody spoke. The vibration of the phone was audible in the quiet of the store. Plastic on wood, repeating in steady rhythm. A call nobody was answering. Tung didn't pick up. Mrs. Hung looked at the phone and then looked away. Mr. Phuc looked at the phone and didn't look away. Officer Duke looked at Tung. The phone vibrated twice more, then stopped. The store went quiet again. A different quality of quiet than before. Heavier, denser, as though the air had changed composition in a way nobody could see. Tung placed the phone on the counter surface. His fingers pressed a few buttons, turned on the external speaker, played back the voicemail that had just been left. What came from the speaker was not a voice, no words, just sound. First crying, small, voiceless. The kind of crying that belongs to someone who has cried alone so long they no longer need sound to do it. Mrs. Hung recognized it. The same sound that had come through the wall at 11:30 that night. The same sound from inside the wardrobe at 3 in the morning. She sat still, said nothing. Then the sound of pages turning. The soft drag of paper, steady, deliberate. Someone turning pages one by one in the dark. Mr. Phuc recognized it. The sound he had heard from his file cabinet the night he opened it and found the damp fingerprint on the rezoning document. He remained standing against the wall. His face didn't change, only his hands tightened. Then breathing, long, even. Not the breathing of someone in motion, the breathing of someone sitting completely still, letting the air move in and out at its own slow pace. 23 seconds. Tung counted without knowing he was counting. He recognized this breathing because he had heard it every night since she disappeared. In the dream, and in the sound of the knife, and in the smell of ripe oi in the dark, empty store. Then silence. The speaker went quiet. The voicemail ended. The three of them didn't look at each other. Officer Duke sat with his notepad open, pen in hand, nothing written since the afternoon had begun. Then the phone cut out. Not gradually. Gone in one moment, the screen going black, and from one corner of the phone, a thin thread of smoke rising, the smell of burning plastic, faint and dissolving quickly in the air of the store. The phone lay on the counter, black, silent, one corner scorched. Mr. Phuc pushed himself off the wall, said nothing to anyone, walked to the door of the store. Outside, he stopped in the late afternoon light for a moment, then walked away. Mrs. Hung stood and followed, also without a word. Out the door, not looking back. Tung remained alone with the burned phone on the counter. Officer Duke sat across from him, notepad still open, pen still in hand. A long time passed. Officer Duke looked at the phone, looked at Tung, then looked down at his notepad. A blank white page, nothing added since the start of the afternoon. Tung placed his hand on the burned phone, didn't lift it, just put his hand on it, the plastic still warm under his palm. Then he spoke, quietly, not looking at anyone, looking at the worn wooden counter surface in front of him. "I'm sorry, Grandma." No answer came. The store was silent. The late March afternoon light lay in a long strip across the tile floor through the open door, warm and ordinary, in the way afternoon light never knows where it's falling. Then jasmine, drifting through, very faint, There and gone in less than one breath.
Officer Duke closed his notepad, stood up, looked around the store one time. The old wooden counter, the bottles and boxes still arranged on the shelves, the old wooden chair behind the counter where Mrs. Ngan used to sit. Said nothing. Stepped out the door. None of them told anyone what they had heard in that voicemail. Not because they had agreed between themselves to stay quiet, but because nobody needed to discuss it. There are things people know without needing to speak them to each other, known through something deeper than thought, and known too that, if put into words, they would become something else, something smaller and less true than what they already were. Mr. Phuc went home, ate dinner, watched television with his wife until 9, then said he was going to bed early. In the bedroom, instead of sleeping, he sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Then he took out his phone and called the person in charge of the district rezoning project. The other end was surprised at the late hour. Mr. Phuc said, "I need to report back about the project. The plot behind Mrs. Ngan's store in Dong Phu village. I haven't notified the owner yet. We need to pause to handle the documentation properly." The other end asked, "Why only now?" He said, "I apologize for the delay, but it has to be done correctly." After he hung up, he sat still in the dark bedroom. Not relieved, not heavier. Just something slightly smaller than before. The way it feels when you've been holding something too long and you set it down and your hand still holds the shape of it for a moment before it lets go completely. Mrs. Hang went home, cooked dinner, washed the dishes, bathed her child and put the child to bed. Her husband asked why she was so quiet today. She said tired. He didn't ask more. Late at night, when her husband was asleep, she opened the wardrobe, found the old wallet, counted the money. 2 million dong still there. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the folded bills in her hand, looked at them. 2 million dong in 1998 was not the same as 2 million dong now. Life had changed. Prices had changed. The weight of this money against 5 years ago was different. But that wasn't what she was thinking about. She set the money on the bedside table, left it there. Tomorrow morning, she would take it to Mrs. Ngan's store and place it on the counter. She didn't know if it would mean anything, didn't know if anyone would receive it, but she would take it over. Tung didn't go back to his rented room that night. He stayed in Mrs. Ngan's store, brought an old blanket from the storage room, lay down on the floor of the store, looked up at the ceiling in the dark. He didn't try to sleep, just let the night pass over him. Around 2 in the morning, he heard the knife, the familiar rhythm, steady from behind the counter. This time, he didn't weep, just lay still and listened, and understood that the sound was not frightening, had never been frightening. Just the sound of someone doing their work in the late night, steady and familiar, and so bound to one person that the sound and the person could no longer be separated. The sound of the knife continued until nearly dawn, then stopped when the sky began to lighten in the east. And in the quiet after the knife, the smell of ripe oi once more, faint and brief, and just enough for him to remember all those afternoons sitting on the front step, eating fruit she had peeled, and asking her every question he had about the world. He lay still until the sky was fully light, then sat up, opened the store door, stepped outside and stood in front of the store in the early morning light of Dong Phu, dew still on the yellow chrysanthemum clumps in the yard. He stood there for a moment,
then went back inside, sat down behind the counter, her spot, took the small paring knife from the drawer, looked at it, and sat there waiting, not knowing what he was waiting for, not knowing how long. Just sat, as though this was the most right thing he could do, to sit here after not turning back that night, and wait.
Officer Duke wrote his final report on the 16th day. Alone in the small office at the village administrative center, the single bare bulb overhead throwing pale yellow light across the desk. Outside the window, dark, the sounds of Tung Phuc in the evening drifting in, people calling each other to dinner, children, a dog somewhere. The sounds of an ordinary day ending. He opened his notepad, read back through everything he had written in 16 days. The 3 statements, the questions he'd underlined, the notes in the margins about the places that weren't smooth. And at the bottom of the last page, what he had written on the very first morning at Mrs. Ngan's store. Tea still warm, door open all night, March cold. No evidence, no direct witness, no body, no crime scene, no clear criminal act by anyone. By procedure, the case would be suspended after 30 days without new information. He had known that before he sat down to write the report. He wrote. His hand moved steadily across the page, the new pen running clean, the ink coming out evenly without jamming. He wrote everything that needed to be written in the correct format. Dates, times, witnesses, investigation steps completed, preliminary conclusion. When he reached the conclusion section, he stopped, looked at the blank page waiting for the final lines. He sat with the pen in his hand and thought, not about the report, about what he knew that couldn't go into a report because it wasn't evidence, wasn't a verifiable fact, just something that had formed slowly in his mind over 16 days of listening to 3 people and watching the things that lived around the edges of what they said. Nobody had killed Mrs. Ngan. Tung had come to visit her. They had argued. He had left. He hadn't killed her. Mrs. Hang had heard crying, pulled her curtain across, hadn't gone to look. She hadn't killed her. Mr. Phuc had known where her sister lived and told the police he didn't. He hadn't killed her. But if Tung had not left, if Mrs. Hang had gone to look, if Mr. Phuc had told the truth from the first day, he couldn't finish those sentences. Not because he didn't know how they ended, but because the endings didn't exist in any law he had been taught. There was no statute covering the small decisions of ordinary people on a March night that together added up to something that couldn't be undone. The only punishment available was one that came from no court, and it was already being served. He wrote the rest of the conclusion, put the pen down, folded the report, then sat in the pale yellow light of the small office, looking out the dark window, listening to the village sounds shrinking with the hour, thinking about the ink arrow on the scratch paper on the first day, about the rolling teacup and the stained name, about the smell of jasmine at 2 a.m. in a room with no flowers. He didn't write any of those things anywhere. There was nowhere to write them. They were just what he was carrying away from 16 days in Tung Phuc, things that would stay with him long after anything in the report had been forgotten. He turned off the light, stood up, and walked out. The March night outside was cold and still, mist beginning to settle on the roof tiles and the dirt road. When he rode past Mrs. Ngan's store, he stopped. He didn't know why,
just stopped, looked at the closed door in the dark. Nothing visible through the gap in the wooden door. But he stood there a moment, in the cold, still March night, with the report in his jacket pocket, and the things that couldn't go into it still in him. Then he started the engine, rode away.
A year passed. Mrs. Ngan was still not found. No body, no news, no answer. Her name in the police file remained listed as missing, no updates. The case sitting in a drawer alongside other unresolved ones, under the thin dust of time. The village of Dongfu continued on, the way small places continue after something happens. Life moves forward. People mentioned Mrs. Ngan less often, then only when there was reason to. And then, one day, walked past the old store without immediately remembering what they were walking past. The store had been closed since that night, the padlock chain rusting slowly, the wooden door beginning to rot at the base, the yellow chrysanthemums in the front yard unwatered, dead from April, completely dry by June. Tung never went back to Hanoi. His wife waited a month, then took their child back to her parents' house. He didn't try to stop her, didn't explain much, just said, "I need to stay here a while longer." That while became a year. He rented a small house at the head of the village. Every morning he woke before light and walked to Mrs. Ngan's store and sat in front of the padlocked door from before sunrise. Not selling anything, not opening the store, just sitting in front of the rusting padlock on a stool he'd brought from the rented house, watching the village road and waiting for something he couldn't name. People passing by would nod to him. Gradually, they grew accustomed to the sight of him sitting there, the way they had once grown accustomed to the sight of Mrs. Ngan peeling fruit in the doorway each afternoon. Mrs. Hung took the 2 million dong over to Mrs. Ngan's store the morning after the phone call, slid it through the gap in the door, and left it on the counter. The money sat there in the dark of the store. Nobody took it away. She didn't know what that meant. Only that, from that night, she slept a little more deeply. Not from having made peace with everything, but because she was no longer in debt in some way that money alone couldn't fully account for. The smell of well water was gone from her wardrobe the morning after the phone call. She still used the same bucket at the same well every day, but from then on, she only drew water during daylight, when there was enough light to see to the bottom. Never again at dusk. Mr. Phuc stopped being village head in June, resigned citing health reasons. Nobody asked many questions. He'd served a long time. His age was showing. Stepping down seemed right. He came home, grew vegetables in his garden, sat on the front porch in the afternoon drinking tea alone. Spoke less than before. His wife said he was getting quieter with age. That might have been true. It might have been something else. The land plot behind Mrs. Ngan's store was no longer in the rezoning plan. Mr. Phuc had stopped it before any official decision was made. The plot was now just the yard behind an abandoned grocery store, grass growing through the rainy season, nobody doing anything with it, nobody asking about it. On the anniversary of Mrs. Ngan's disappearance, all three came to the store. Nobody had invited anyone. Tung had already been there since morning. Mrs. Hung arrived in the late afternoon, carrying a small package. Mr. Phuc arrived last, stood at the door for a moment, then stepped inside. Mrs. Hung set on the counter a plate of peeled oi, a few cups, a pot of tea still steaming. Nobody asked her when she had peeled it. Nobody mentioned the phone call. Nobody said much of anything. The three of them sat in the dark store,
only the small candle Mrs. Hung had brought lit on the counter surface. A small flame, the light yellow and unsteady, the shadows of 3 people falling long against the walls behind them. On the counter, the pot of tea steamed. Nobody poured any, just left it there. The way people leave things for someone no longer present, not knowing whether they'll come to receive it, but leaving it because not leaving it would be wrong. The 3 of them stayed until the candle burned out, then left. Not a word to each other the whole time. None needed. The next morning, Tung came to the store as he did every morning. Looked at the counter. The plate of oi still there, a few slices untouched. The teapot cold. But there was something else on the counter now that hadn't been there the night before. A peel. One long strip of oi peel, peeled in a single unbroken curl, coiled into a circle on the wooden surface.
He stood looking at the peel. No knife on the counter. Nothing else disturbed, just that one peel sitting alone on the smooth, worn wood. Peeled evenly. One continuous strip, unbroken. He sat down in the chair behind the counter, looked at the peel for a long time. Then he took the plate, gathered the remaining oi slices from the night before, arranged them neatly, set the plate back on the counter. Sat there. The sounds of the village outside coming through the open door, roosters, people heading to the morning market, bicycle wheels on the dirt road. The sounds of another ordinary day beginning. Mrs. Ngan was never found. No body, no explanation. No day to mark the end of it and move to the next thing. Just a 55-year-old widow, owner of a small grocery store in the village of Phuc, who disappeared on a Friday night in March 2003 and never came back. That open ending was the hardest thing to live with. Not grief, exactly. People know how to live with grief. They know what a funeral is, what a death anniversary is, the shape of loss and continuing. But there is no funeral for a missing person, no official anniversary. Just the absence, shaped like someone sitting behind a grocery counter, and the sound of a knife gone from every afternoon in March. The 3 of them never told anyone what they had heard in the voicemail, not for the rest of their lives. But there was one thing all 3 understood without needing to say it to each other. After that night, the smell of jasmine never appeared again. The sound of the knife never came again. The wardrobe never smelled of well water again. The damp fingerprint on the rezoning document never reappeared. Just silence. And 3 people living inside that silence in 3 separate ways, carrying questions they couldn't answer, couldn't set down, only learned to walk alongside each day. There are things that once you know them, you cannot unknow. Tung knew the sound of her crying at the head of the lane and the cold key in his hand when he decided to keep going. Mrs. Hang knew the wardrobe and the smell of the well and the real reason she hadn't gone outside that night. Mr. Phuc knew his own signature on the rezoning document and the question the dream had asked him. Who am I protecting? None of them thought of themselves as bad people. That was the hardest part. If they had been bad people, the story would be simpler. Bad people can be punished, can confess, can reach some kind of ending that is clear. But they weren't bad people. They were ordinary people who made small decisions on a March night, each with their own reason, none of them knowing that 3 small decisions together could add up to something that couldn't be taken back. And Mrs. Ngan. She didn't come back to take revenge, didn't come back to collect a debt, didn't come back to frighten anyone. Just those small traces left after she was gone, the jasmine drifting through, the sound of the knife in the dark store, the coil of oi peel on the counter the morning after the anniversary. the traces of someone still present in some way, or of a memory strong enough to produce things that looked like presence. The line between those two things at 3 in the morning is thinner than people think. 6 months after Mrs. Ngan disappeared, Officer Duke received a transfer to the district level. A small promotion. More work, better pay, farther from the village of Dongfu. He accepted, thanked his superiors, went back to his rented room to pack. On his last afternoon in the village, before leaving, he stopped at Mrs. Ngan's store. No particular reason, just that when he was riding past, he stopped, the way people stop at certain places one last time before leaving for good. The padlock chain was rusted through, the wooden door rotting at the base, the green paint peeling away in patches. He looked through the gap in the wooden panels into the interior. Dust everywhere, across the wooden counter surface, across the bottles and boxes still sitting on the shelves, across the tile floor, across every surface that the light coming through the door gap could reach. Pale and fine and even. 6 months of no one here. A thin layer that covered everything like the first snowfall on ground that had been waiting. Only one place the dust could not settle. The old wooden chair behind the counter, where Mrs. Ngan used to sit every afternoon to peel fruit. The seat surface was completely clean, not a single grain of dust. He stood looking at that chair through the door gap, at the clean seat in the surrounding dust. 6 months, the store empty of people. Dust settled everywhere, but the seat of that chair still clean, as though someone had been sitting there every day for 6 months, sitting long enough that dust had no room to land, then standing and going somewhere, and coming back the next day to sit again. He stood and looked for a while. Didn't explain it. Didn't try to. Then he looked at the old calendar hanging on the inner wall. March 2003. The calendar stopped at the 12th. Every day after that, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, all the remaining days of March and the months that followed had been scratched through by someone using a fingernail. Not torn out, not crossed with a pen, but scratched, each day individually, the marks shallow but layered, erasing the printed numbers, erasing the days that had never arrived inside this store. As though for this small grocery store, for this wooden counter and this wooden chair, and the clumps of dead chrysanthemums in the front yard, time had stopped on a Friday night in March. And only Mrs. Ngan knew when it would start again. Officer Duke stood in front of the gap in Mrs. Ngan's wooden door in the September afternoon light for a long time. Then he turned away, walked out onto the village road, looked toward the far end of the inner lane. Tung's house. Mrs. Hang's house, door closed, smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney. Mr. Phuc's house. Someone sitting on the front porch, but too far to see clearly who. He thought about the report he had written months ago, and the things that hadn't gone into it. There are wrongs that exist in no law book. Cannot be arrested, cannot be tried, cannot be forgiven, can only be lived with. He walked toward where his motorbike was parked, started the engine, rode out of Dongfu for the last time as someone posted there on the red dirt road with rice paddies on both sides green in the September growth of the late-year crop. And if he had looked back through his mirror, back toward Mrs. Ngan's store standing at the head of the inner lane in the fading afternoon light, he might have seen, or might not have seen, a small shadow in the chair behind the counter. Hair pinned low,
sitting straight, both hands resting on the counter surface, waiting, as though there were still someone who hadn't yet answered the question she was holding, and she could sit there as much longer as it took. She was used to waiting. The end. There are people who go missing and are never found, not because nobody looked, but because the people who knew the most looked away. Each of them had a reason. Each reason seemed large enough at the time. Tung had his reason. Mrs. Hang had hers. Mr. Phuc had his. None of them thought of themselves as bad people, and that is the most frightening thing. Not the shadow in the old wooden chair. Not the calendar scratched through from the 13th of March. Not the sound of a knife in an empty store.
But 3 ordinary people making small decisions on a March night. And Mrs. Ngan still sitting there waiting, not knowing how much longer.